You have now entered the no friend zone. You have now entered the no friend zone.
Shalom, shalom, family, shalom, peace and blessings to you, family. This is Elder Yara, giving all praises to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to our ancestors, to Yeshua, Mashiach, the prophet of our time, showed us how to walk the Torah out circumspectly and live it till its fullest. Preaching us the ways and the light and the knowledge how to return the right standing relationship with Abba Father. We're going to get it in tonight. We're going to continue this lecture series and really get into the full presentation. If you haven't watched the previous introduction to this, I suggest that you go back, listen to it. It's about an hour and 15 minutes long. It's just an introduction into this particular presentation. We're going to be talking about the instructions of Amenemope or Amenemope in regards to Proverbs chapters 22, 23, and some of 24. Is there a true case for plagiarism? I've had many people reach out to me about the topic. And so I'm going to go into some things. I'm going to show you what's actually being taught, what's actually being said. We're going to read out of some of the instructions of Amenemope as well. We're going to do it based on a comparative contextual analysis. We're also going to do it on a thematic analysis or understanding. And basically, we're talking about thematic. We're talking about looking for certain patterns in the actual text. We gave a lot of good information in the previous show on yesterday in regards to this topic. I sort of set the premise in this introduction for it, but we're really going to get into quite a bit of information in regards to this. This is something that you have to unpack. I've noticed and I've known and I've witnessed over the course of these conversations, especially lately, in our community when it comes to dealing with this topic in regards to plagiarism. This is the go-to argument, right? That a lot of the critics of the Hebrew Bible, that a lot of the critics of the word of the Most High, the inspired word of the Most High written by men, this is the most go-to text that they pull out in Proverbs chapters 22, 23, and 24, that some we know we could say was written by, from my belief, King Solomon. And then there's other parts of those texts in Proverbs. The wisdom text is actually a poem that was written by others. And what we want to do is really get into the understanding of what it is that we see here. I know a lot of people in the community, conscious, unconscious community, like to think that this topic is a foregone conclusion because they look at it and they make an assumption that's saying, hey, because we see similar things written here, it must have been plagiarized, it must have been stolen, or it's a copy. Well, all of those things are really argued synonymously when it comes to dealing with this particular passage of scripture in the Hebrew Bible, specifically Proverbs chapters 22, 23, and 24. And so when we talk about the instructions of Amenemope, we really don't hear but delve into a degree where we see these things occurring. Shalom, Yahoo. Shalom, Anonymous. We appreciate you, family. Y'all please hit that like button, like, share, and subscribe. Let someone know that we're going to be addressing one of the major topics in regards to the instructions of Amenemope in Proverbs chapters 22, 23, and 24 to some degree. And I'm going to be going into some information. I'm not going to be looking at the time, but I'm going to get right into the presentation. And we're just going to get it in now. Hallelujah. Let me share my screen. Again, if you haven't hit that like button, like, share, and subscribe. Let someone know if you're interested in this topic. Let someone know that we're live here and we're going in, right? And again, as I brought out for this particular, I'm gonna make this a little bit bigger so the family can see it. For this particular topic, there's a methodology that we must employ, right? We must employ this particular methodology when we're dealing with the instructions of Amenemope and Proverbs chapters 22, 23, and 24, right? In the argument, is there evidence of plagiarism, right? I talked about in the introduction on yesterday that there are different types of plagiarism. But often the type of plagiarism that we hear that's attributed to these two wisdom texts, right? Proverbs 23 and the instructions of Amenemope, is that it's a copy. It's a virtual copy. Well, that's not the case, because you clearly see, if you just put the two wisdom literatures side by side, you'll clearly see it's not a word for word copy. So therefore, the argument of direct plagiarism must be taken off of the table automatically. Doesn't take a scholar to understand that. Doesn't take a scholar to understand that at all. But let's deal with comparative contextual analysis and the methodology here. It's a methodology for comparative research where contextual interrogation precedes any analysis of similarity and difference, right? So in other words, we have to delve into the context between the two wisdom literatures, Proverbs 22, 23, 24, and the instructions of Amenemope. We have to get into the context of both of these wisdom literatures. That overrides, that analysis of itself overrides or precedes. It must come before you get into an argument of similarity and indifference. If you don't deal with the contextual understanding of it, the contextual, comparative contextual analysis between the two wisdom literatures, if you don't approach it that way first, that's the proper methodology. If you don't approach it that way first, then you really have no basis of argument for similarity and difference. You can't say it's copy. And I guarantee you, once we go on in this presentation, once we start to get into the contextual analysis, then we'll see why similarity and difference is secondary to the fact that these two wisdom literatures are not one of the same. And no one can make that claim. No one can make that claim for direct plagiarism. As I said before, you won't see a word for word copy. So that particular argument, again, is off the table. It is a thematic process. And we're going to get into what thematic process is in the next slide, directed and designed to explore relationships of agency rather than institutional or structural frameworks. That's important. A comparative contextual analysis in this argument has to be presented. If you have any ones that's before you making this argument that they're plagiarized, that Proverbs 22, 23, and 24, the Hebrew Bible plagiarizes the instructions of Amenemope, if they don't start with the comparative contextual analysis, then you can dismiss their presentation in full. You can dismiss their work in full because it doesn't follow the proper methodology in making that argument. That's simple. That's simple. Let's get into what thematic process is, because these things are important to understanding how we should read and do a comparison of both wisdom literature texts. You have to do this. You have to go through these processes. The thematic analysis is a method of analyzing qualitative data that entails searching across a data set to identify, analyze, and this is most important, report repeated patterns. Question: if we look at the instructions of Amenemope in Proverbs chapters 22, 23, and 24, will we see like repeated patterns? Will we see the same repeated patterns? If you don't see the same repeated patterns in both texts, and for a formula, as it is written, when you get to Proverbs 22 and 23, and the instructions of Amenemope, if the instructions of Amenemope begins A, B, and C, then we should see Proverbs 22 and 23 and some of 24 should also begin A, B, C. It's a simple formula. If it doesn't follow that, then you have to wonder how you can make a true comparison. You can't have something that says A, B, and C, and then you compare it over here to X, Y, and Z. The pattern has to be the same. You can't have A, B, and C, and then AA, BB, CC, DD. That's not the same. The patterns don't align. So you can't make a general comparison. Not dealing with these wisdom literature texts. You can't do it. You have to understand that. A source on that is Braun and Clark, 2006. When you're dealing with thematic analysis, right? It is a method for describing data, but it also involves, listen to this, interpretation in the processes of selecting codes and constructing themes. If you don't see similar patterns between the two texts, you can't make an argument that the themes that are being constructed in both documents are the same. Therefore, your argument of plagiarism crumbles before you. It's really that simple. Let's continue. Now we have to deal with parallelism, right? Parallelism in Hebrew poetry, because what we have to understand in regards to Proverbs chapters 22, 23, and 24 is that it's considered a poem. This is what we have to understand. It's considered a poem, right? And so when we talk about parallelism, especially in Hebrew history and Hebrew poetry, which is how we have to categorize properly Proverbs chapters 22, 23, and 24 as Hebrew poetry, Hebraic poetry, there are different types of parallelism that you have to look for, right? When it comes to the instructions of Amenemope, because they'll say, well, you see similar parallels between the two wisdom literatures. Well, let's look at the differences in parallelism, right? These things are important, right? And you can see here, just in the Jewish Encyclopedia, you can go to parallelism in Hebrew poetry, right? The first one is synonymous, right? In which the same sentiment is repeated in different
but equivalent words, right? The second one is antithetical, in which the parallel members express the opposite sides of the same thought. 3, synthetical, in which the two members contain two disparate ideas, which, however, are connected by a certain affinity between them. Number 4, paleological parallelism, in which one or more words of the first line are taken up, like an echo in the second. Number 5, perfect and imperfect parallelism, according to the equality or inequality of the number of words in each line. In number 6, we have introverted parallelisms or chiasms. This is what we see often in Hebrew scripture, right? So parallelism in Hebrew poetry, what is a proverb? You have to understand what the book of Proverbs is, how we define it, and actually what it is, according to the Hebraic culture, before we even start making a true comparison to the instructions of Amenemope, which is in Egyptian literature, right? Wisdom text. These things are important for understanding the argument in earnest. If you don't understand that, then there's an issue with your understanding on even comparing both the instructions of Amenemope and Proverbs chapters 22, 23, and 24. It's not as simple as placing the two texts, the wisdom literatures, side by side and saying, hey, look, see, they sound the same. Again, there's no direct plagiarism. Direct plagiarism is defined simply by word for word copy. That does not exist between the two wisdom literatures. So plagiarism, direct plagiarism specifically, is off the table. It's off the table, right? So let's begin with that. Now let's start. What is a proverb? According to Merriam-Webster 2003, a proverb is a brief epigram or maxim, right? And an epigram is a short poem characterized as sage, witty, and often paradoxical, right? That's page 420, the Merriam-Webster Dictionary 2003, and what a proverb is. Walkie 2004 adds that in English, and we're going to read a little bit of what he writes about the instructions of Amenemope and Proverbs later on. It says, adds that in English, proverbs typically are short, pithy, and possesses popular currency, right? Page 56. In his commentary on the book of Proverbs, Buzzle in 1985 notes that Hebrew proverbs typically consist of 2 or 3 lines and draw upon what? Common experiences. So when we read in the book of Proverbs, what are they saying is occurring here? Common experiences. Not unique to one particular culture, not unique to Kemet, not unique to Samaria, not unique to the Akkadian culture, not unique to the Libyan culture, not unique to all of the other ancient Near East cultures that we find, that these wisdom literatures are often found. Common experiences. Common experiences, right? There are many of us who have grown up in our adulthood, in our childhood, middle age, and our parents and friends. Some of us are just acquaintances on social media. Some of us are acquaintances outside of social media. But there are many people in this country and even in this world that we have not had any verbal communication with, no communication at all. But I guarantee you that somewhere we can all find and share common experiences. Does that mean if I read about your common experiences that you experienced growing up as a child, in say Nantucket, Tennessee, or Kentucky, or wherever Nantucket is, I think it's in Tennessee. The common experiences that you had may slightly differ from what I had growing up in a big city, right? Like Chicago, growing up in a big city. But yet we can find common experiences. Now, if I write a book about my life and I share those common experiences, or you write a book about your life and you share those common experiences, we're going to have some similarities in the things that we're discussing, in the things that we're sharing. Because why? We have common experiences as human beings. We have common experiences. Does that denote plagiarism? If you wrote yours first and then I write mine and I share my common experiences seem to mirror your common experiences. How can you argue for plagiarism? And the arguments that we hear in this particular community when it comes to the instructions of Amenemope in Proverbs chapters 22, 23, and some of 24, that's the surface level argument that we're getting. Because we see common experiences. The instructions of Amenemope is a man sharing common experiences or common knowledge with his son, according to this text, according to the wisdom literature of Amenemope. In Proverbs, what we have is wisdom literature that talks about like common experiences. But Solomon, is he addressing this to a son? These things that this Proverbs that has been attributed to King Solomon? Is he addressing a son? Is he addressing a particular person? But we're talking about shared common experiences. And this is the scope, the only scope we have in making a connection between these two wisdom literatures. Right? Again, Proverbs is written in a Hebraic style in which would be considered poetic. It's a poem. These are the things we have to understand. So, again, family, like, share, and subscribe. Send this out to those who've had this question about this. Those who say, see, that the ancient Kemet had a great influence on the Hebraic Bible to the point that it's stolen literature. It's impossible to make that assumption. It's false. It's false. Right? Let's continue. In their description of wisdom literature, Duval and Hayes, and I'm giving source information. I'm giving you source information. I'm giving you sources that you can go to and read and study for yourselves about what and why this particular presentation is being done to show that the arguments that are being had, whether or not plagiarism existed between the two wisdom literatures, has no weight. It really has no weight, right? So I'm giving you these sources in here so that if you go back and use it as a reference, you can, right? Duval and Hayes emphasize that Hebrew proverbs are a type of poem designed to cause their readers to listen, look, think, and reflect. That's page 390, right? As a means of internalizing wisdom. As such, Murphy, 1999, notes that proverbs typically employ significant symbolism. Significant symbolism. When you look at the instructions of Amenemope, and you look at Proverbs chapters 22, 23, and some of 24, You're not going to find comedic symbolism in the book of Proverbs. It's not there. There's no attestation to Ra on any of their deities. None of their cultural practices. It pays no homage to Ma'at. None of that. None of that. So we have to understand that the symbolisms that do occur in Proverbs, these are not on the surface or in the material culture of ancient Kemet. It's just not there. The symbolism does not exist between the two. So that's another strike against plagiarism. Remember what I said earlier about patterns, the thematic process, about patterns. We don't see Egyptian symbolism in Proverbs chapters 22, 23, and 24. And vice versa, for that matter. You don't see Hebraic material culture in the instructions of Amenemope. And if they're the same, if they're both taken from the same, we should see the same. But you can't have, again, A, B, and C, and then say, look, over here it's A, B, B, C, C, so it's the same. No, that's not how it works. That's not direct plagiarism. That's not a copy. A copy is A is here, A is over here. B is here, B is over here. C is over here, C is over here. Then you have an argument, but that's not what we have between the two wisdom literatures. Right? So again, let's continue. Some authors, such as Van Leeuwen in 2015, have attempted to differentiate between proverbs and sayings based upon their poetic and stylistic qualities. However, no consensus exists regarding the distinction, right? Walkie 2004. For this reason, in the present analysis, the terms proverb and saying are used interchangeably. So this is what I'm saying. Like when we're talking about these different things, we have to understand in what context they're being used, right? And what parallels are being made. Let's continue for the next slide, right? These things are important. And I have to build it this way, family, because I want people not to walk away with simply me saying, oh, it's just not plagiarized. It's just not plagiarized. That would be a disservice to this topic and even bringing it out. And this is one of the reasons why you don't see many teachers in Israel, and some have attempted to do it, but you don't see many attempting to address it. All praise to the Most High, because they don't understand in and of itself the cultural context, the comparative contextual analysis, and the thematic process that you have to have involved in going into understanding the two wisdom texts and where they differ. And even if there are some similarities that exist, the comparative context has to precede it. You have to do that first, right? Which is what we talked about earlier at the beginning of the show. That's the methodology, right? So let's continue with the understanding of parallelism. Is of 7 kinds, 3 simple and 4 complex, right? And here's the source if you really want to get into it. This is Figures of Speech used in the Bible, explained and illustrated, right? E.W. Bellinger, 1898, Figures of Speech used in the Bible, page 349, London, New York, so forth and so on. So here's the source for that. And this hasn't changed today. It's pretty much simple. And I went over it earlier a little bit, but I'm going to go through it again, right? You have parallelisms. You have simple parallelisms, right? Which is synonymous or gradational parallelisms. Antithetic or opposite. Synthetic or constructive. Then you have the more complex understanding of parallelisms. And the reason why parallelisms is important to this discussion is because this is the context or the box people often try to place the two wisdom texts in and say, look, there are parallels here. Well, let's understand what these parallels are that you're referring to, if they exist at all. But let's look into them. Let's not run through this, right? Right? This is a lecture for this particular topic, right? So let's look at this, right? So the complex understanding of parallelisms, right? You have alternate, which is 2 lines repeated only once, 4 lines in all. Repeated alternations, you have 2 lines repeated more than once, right? That's talking about that thematic process, right? That methodology there in the parallelisms, the patterns that you will see, right? The extended alternations, the 3 or more lines repeated, right? And then you have the introverted, right? Well, the introverted parallelisms that you find on pages 356 and 362 in this source here, figures of speech used in the Bible, explained and illustrated. It says, this is when the parallel lines are so placed that if there be 6 lines, the first corresponds with the 6th, the second with the 5th, and the third with the 4th. When this introversion consists only of words and of the same words, it is called an eponodos, right? Let me see if I can move this out of the way. I don't want to do that. When propositions are introverted, it is called antimetabole, right? When subjects are introverted, it's called chasms or chasms. And oftentimes that's what you see in Hebrew text, right? So let's continue. It's important to understand these things. Right, let's continue. Peace and blessings, family. I see y'all in the chat, man. I appreciate y'all for coming in, man, and joining us, man. Please like, share, and subscribe. Shout out to you, Sister Noble. I appreciate you always. KOT, Principal Yahweh, I see you, fam. I see you in the building. Tanks on the ground. Simon Lowe, Shalom, again, Yam Yahoo, Israel. I appreciate you, fam. Simeon, the atheist killer. I appreciate you, fam. Peace to you, Sosa. Peace to you, family. Always love, brother. To see you in the building, man. Shalom. But let's continue. Right now, let's really start to really get and unpackage this thing, right? And again, I just want to preface this. If you didn't see the introduction to this presentation, it's separate. I did it yesterday on my channel. It's about an hour, 15 minutes, maybe an hour, 30 minutes, somewhere up in there. Just the introduction and how to build the understanding, the premise, and building the understanding how to rightly divide these 2 particular wisdom texts, the instructions of Amenemope in Proverbs 22, 23, and 24, right? As Shaw determined, right? And this, we're talking about Benjamin Shaw, professor of Old Testament studies at the Reformation Bible College, right? This is what he says. As Shaw determined, the only way to show this and evaluate it is to give the Proverbs text and the Amenemope text together, right? For the text of Amenemope, Shaw used the translation given in James B. Pritchard, The Ancient Near East, Volume 1, an anthology of texts and pictures, pages 237 and 43. This is a great source for understanding what we should be looking at and how we should be comparing. Goes back to the methodology that we opened up with, the contextual comparative analysis. This helps to bolster that methodology, right? These are 2 great sources, right? Benjamin Shaw, professor of Old Testament at Reformation Bible College, and James B. Pritchard, The Ancient Near East, Volume 1, an anthology of texts and pictures, pages 237 to 243. Shaw cites by page and line number, counting lines from the beginning of each chapter. For Proverbs, Shaw used the ESV, the English Standard Version, and Shaw also used the parallels as they are specified in Pritchard. And I'm going to show you how they broke this down and what they used, because it gives a more clear and distinct understanding of how we need to analyze both these texts properly, right? Because again, the argument ultimately is there evidence of plagiarism between the instructions of Amenemope and Proverbs chapters 22, 23, and 24, and some of 24. Let's get into it. Shalom, FSK. Shalom. Peace and blessings. So let's deal with it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to first show you the parallels. A lot of this taken from Pritchard, but I'm going to show you the first parallels I'm going to show you the parallel first in Proverbs, and then I'm going to show you the parallel in the instructions of Amenemope. And so already off the bat, as I said before earlier several times throughout this presentation so far, the understanding and the idea and the definition of direct plagiarism, which is copy word for word from one text of literature to the next, we have to throw that argument out the door. That's gone. Because when we simply look at it with our eyes, just doing the comparative, putting them side by side, we clearly see there's no direct word for word copy. There's no direct word for word translations here between the two texts, or corresponding or cohesive text between the two, cohesiveness between the two, right? You don't see that here. So when you have the argument of stolen, copy, and plagiarize, direct plagiarism, those arguments are gone, just on the basic understanding of it, right? So now let's continue. We also talked about common experiences. That's what Proverbs are. These are sharing of common experiences, right? Same thing in wisdom literature texts that we see in the instructions of Amenemope. These are common experiences, not unique to a specific culture. Right? Listen, thou shalt not steal. That's not unique to the Bible. It's just not. It's a moral compass that exists in many cultures. And so for someone to write that and record it, and then for someone to come along and say, look, someone else wrote that first, they must have stolen it from here, it's a very bad argument, people. And we're going to get into even why they even began to compare the two wisdom literatures. Let's get into it. A first parallel here. Proverbs 22, and this is where it begins. This is where the arguments actually began. Proverbs chapter 22, verses 17 and 18. And when you have 8 here, that's just the first line, right? It says, incline your ear. This is the book of Proverbs. Incline your ear and hear the words of the wise, and apply your heart to my knowledge, for it will be pleasant if you keep them within you. Now let's look at the first parallel that people often make, right? This is Amenemope, very first chapter. We already see we can't talk about direct plagiarism or something taking copy word from word, because we already see, and as I explained before, the patterns even of itself are off. So the Amenemope reads in the first chapter, page 237, lines 1, 2, 3, give thy ears, hear what is said, give thy heart to understand them, to put them in thy heart is worthwhile. Right? Now here, this begins in the first chapter of Amenemope. Right? Here, we're already in the 22nd chapter of the book of Proverbs. So already we don't have a direct pattern. And we talked about this earlier in the presentation. If you missed it, go back in the first 5 minutes of the opening of this. This is what we talked about, right? And I'm going to go through these, right? Second parallel, Proverbs 22:18, B, 19. This is the second line after this, 18. It says, if all of them are ready on your lips, that your trust may be in the Lord. I have made them know to you today, even to you. Right? Now, here's one of the biggest ones that I want to get people to understand here, right? It's blaring, right? Here you see, and this is what I'm talking about when we start talking about the culture. It says that your trust may be in who? Yahweh. He says if all of them are ready on your lips, right? The words of the wise, and apply your heart, your knowledge. That's from the chapters very first above it. It will be pleasant to keep them within you. If all of those pleasant sayings, listen to what it's saying. If all of those pleasant sayings that apply to your heart or your mind, or to is your knowledge, for it will be pleasant for you or to you if you keep them within you. Keep what within you? These sayings. What sayings are we talking about? This wisdom and this knowledge, right? Listen to what it says here. He says, if all of them are ready on your lips, if they're constantly on your lips, you're constantly speaking these pleasant and positive things, right? These wisdoms. If you're repeating these things, it says that your trust may be in the Lord or Yahweh. I have made them know to you today, even to you. So Solomon is saying, listen, these wonderful things, these blessings, these salutations, these exhortations, these proverbs, these words of wisdom, they're pleasant things, that your trust may be in the Lord. This is what he's teaching here, to trust in the Most High. But what is the second parallel that people talk about in the instructions of Amenemope? Watch this. We're still in the first chapter. It says, and this is just lines 8 through 10, right? And automatically we see that we're not talking about a direct copy, because no comparison or parallelism is made from lines only lines 1, 2, 3, but lines 4, 5, 6, and 7. There's no parallel made to it in between the instructions of Amenemope in Proverbs chapter 22. Right? Again, watch what this says. This says those wise words, those things that are on your heart and on your mind, right? The scripture talks about think on these things. Whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, right? Think on these things. He says what? That your trust may be in the Lord. So let's read it again. If all of them are ready on your lips, that your trust may be in the Lord. What Lord? Yahweh. Right? He says, I have made them know to you today, even to you. Now watch what this says in Amenemope that they're making a parallelism to. They shall be a mooring stake for thy tongue. If thou spendest thy time while this is in thy heart, that will find it a success. Like some of this stuff, when you really start to go through it and you really begin to go into it, I'm not saying the instructions of Amenemope that it's not wisdom. There is wisdom in it. But to say that it's plagiarized by Proverbs chapters 22, 23, and 24, or that Proverbs chapter 22, 23, and 24 are taken directly from the instructions of Amenemope, we already see right now in the first and second parallels that people often make between the two wisdom literatures. It's just not. We're talking about common understanding. But when you get to the second parallel of Proverbs 22, verses 18 and 19, he says, incline these things, let these things be ready on your lips so that your trust may be in the Most High, that your trust may be in the Lord, that your trust may be in Yahweh. Where is that? Where are we seeing in the second parallel of Amenemope that your trust should be in Ra or Osiris? Huh? Asar or Set. Where are we seeing that? Here. We're not seeing that. So how are they making a parallel? Simply because someone says if you keep wise thoughts on your mind and in your heart, you'll have great success. Versus to what they're saying here in Proverbs, he's saying not only if you keep these things on your heart and in your mind, he says, but your trust must be in the Most High God of Israel. How are they making the comparison here, family? This is what I'm saying. We got to really understand these arguments. Instead of taking these things for face value, taking these things because we hear it and it sounds good. The Bible speaks about people who have itching ears. These things are not there, right? And I'm going to show you guys some other text that will we're going to show you even later on. I'm just going to leave you. I'm going to actually show you who the God of Amenemope was, who he actually worshipped. You're going to be very surprised. Let's continue. There are about 15 of these. The third parallel, Proverbs 22 and 22. Do not rob the poor because he is poor, or crush the afflicted at the gate. Now, we know that in Hebrew culture, the sick and the poor, the widow and the orphan, often sat at the gate. We have the story, even in the New Testament, we have the story of the lepers. They had to sit outside of the gate, but they were at the gate. Why? Seeking alms, pity, and mercy. That's Hebraic culture. Why would they go to the gate? We even read this further on in Proverbs, I believe it's Proverbs 31, when it talks about a virtuous woman. It talks about how the women were real estate investors, and I'm paraphrasing, but basically this is what it says. They invested in real estate, they saw a field and they bought it. They were real estate investors. So when people always talk about the Bible is against women, that's foolishness. Proverbs chapter 31, the virtuous woman. You'll see how a mother is teaching her son, King Lemuel, to find the perfect wife. And the perfect wife that he tells her to find, she considers a field and buys it. And she keeps her household together. She keeps everything in decency and in order. While the men do what? Go out into the city and discuss the affairs of state. And discuss and have debates about the scripture and how to better walk and live out the Torah circumspectly. This is what you read in Proverbs 31. It's important. The officials, the important people would rest at the gate. And this is where they would come and they would have these major discussions. So the wealthier, the more prominent people in the Israelite culture, they would be at the gate. Why? Because at the gate of what? The gate of the city, the gate of the temple. This is where the people that ruled those that were ruling would be in those spaces. And so that's why the poor and the downtrodden would often go to those places for alms. Because according to Hebrew Israelite culture or Hebraic culture, you couldn't see your brother begging and walk past him. You had to assist. You had to help them. You had to help your brother. You had to help your sister. Right? You had to help the widow and the orphan. right? So this is why they would go there, right? We even see a similar to this, but even later on in the New Testament scripture, we see Christ talk about helping, assisting the Good Samaritan. And this is why people were stepping over him, because he necessarily was not an Israelite. So they didn't feel obligated, according to the law and according to their culture, to help him, the Samaritan. I mean, I'm sorry, the Israelite. And what we see the topic of the Good Samaritan, so like it. Well, we see the Good Samaritan assisting the downtrodden brother, right? And everyone stepped over him, which they weren't supposed to, but the Samaritan came and helped. And so we see just the context of why people were in this particular area of the gates, right? So we read Proverbs 22 again. It says, do not rob the poor because he is poor, or crush the afflicted at the gate. What does he mean by do not rob the poor? Don't take advantage of them. Don't tax them. Don't overtax them. Right? Don't use them because they are poor. Don't have them do a whole day's work and pay them less than what you would pay someone who only worked an hour, simply because they're poor. This is what it's telling you not to do. Or crush the afflicted at the gate. Right? Amenemope in the second chapter, page 32, lines 1 and 2. Guard thyself. And listen to what it's saying. It's not even saying the same thing. It says, guard thyself against robbing the oppressed and against overbearing the disabled. Right? These are things that, again, not copied word for word, but we do see what? Basic moral compass is being talked about. These things are not unique from one culture to the other. It's ludicrous to make these arguments. Let's continue. Fourth parallel, Proverbs 22 and 28. And then it goes into Proverbs 23 in verse 10. And it says, do not move the ancient landmark that your fathers have set. Do not move an ancient landmark or enter the fields of the fatherless. Right? In other words, the scripture tells us, give honor to whom honor is due. Honor thy mother and thy father. Right? This is talking about civility. Right? In respect. Do not move the ancient landmark that your fathers have set. Look upon these things and remember the works that they done. And I'm going to just say this. We got this really bad in our society today, especially among our people. They have no affinity for the ancestors of the people that came and laid and paved the way before them. You got people that got whole arguments against Martin Luther King. You got people who got whole arguments about Malcolm X. You got people who got arguments against Medgar Evers, Angela Davis. You got people who got arguments against Marcus Moshe Garvey. Right? I had a whole debate, a back and forth exchange about folks labeling Marcus Garvey as a scammer. Unfounded accusations, but dismissing the work that he did that paved the way for some of us, even working with the Hebrew Israelites early on. They were working together, side by side, hand in hand at the UNIA. They were working side by side. But you got people today that disparage these leaders. Oh, what did they do for us? They didn't do nothing for us. Forget these people. I don't want to see Harriet Tubman's ugly face on a $20 bill. Without the work that she did, some of your ancestors wouldn't be here for you to make the statement. And that's just the fact. But we're so quick to besmirch the names of those who went before us, who gave their lives in our fight for freedom and justice and civil rights in this particular country. We're so quick. You don't see any other culture do that. You don't see the Irish tearing down their heroes. You don't see the Greeks. You don't see the Italians talk about Christopher Columbus and all that. You don't see that. They know what he did. But they put a Thanksgiving Day parade on every year, right on time. They know what those pilgrims did when they got off those boats and came over here and handed out blankets to smallpox to the Indian population and wiped them all almost off the face of the earth. They know that's factual. They know that they did that. But yet they continue with that Thanksgiving Day parade every year. Every year in November, end of November, you at the White House, they set the White House turkey free. They set a turkey free. They don't do that to their culture, regardless how bad it is and how well they advance them today in this society. We're the only people that besmirch the names of our own freedom fighters and heroes. We're the only group of people that do that. We have to do better, family. It says, well, do not move ancient landmark into the fields of the fathers. Right? Here's the fourth parallel to this. In the instructions of Amenemope, again. Page 238, lines 1 through 8. Do not carry out the landmark at the boundaries of the arable land, nor disturb the position of the measuring cord. Be not greedy for a cubit of land, nor encroach upon the boundaries of a widow. Guard against encroaching upon the boundaries of the field. Now here we see parallels. But understand, there's always been ancient texts dealing with widows. And the protecting of widows. This is just moral standards. Because what you would have is that you would have women whose husbands would be prominent or own land or own property. And the husband would pass away, the wife becomes widowed. And then they would have no way to make money or fend for themselves, other than keeping the crops, the land that their deceased husbands own, keeping that thing going, so that they can have something in order to sustain themselves and often their children. Right? And this is what I say, even when we talk about in the book of Numbers, and dealing with the daughters of Zelophehad, we see they come to Moses with this argument and say, look, our father is gone. We have no husbands. We have no man, no husbands to fend for us. So allow us to not to lose our father's inheritance and everything that he worked for. Allow us to maintain that. Let us keep our father's work, his legacy going amongst his daughters. And Moses entreats the Most High, and then what happens? There's an addendum or an amendment to the law. That's a whole nother topic. There's an amendment or an addendum to the law. And they are allowed to keep it. Moses says, look, just keep it all in the family. Keep it in the tribe. Just keep it in the tribe. So that's in the book of Numbers, well before we get to Proverbs. So we already see there's an understanding that exists in Israel when it comes to dealing with the widow and the poor, property rights. And wealth, protecting the widow. That's in our law, statutes, and commandments, well before we get to Proverbs. Why is no one making the comparison there with the instructions of Amenemope and what we see in the law? This is common knowledge, practical knowledge, everyday experiences. These things happen, right? The fifth parallel, Proverbs 23:11. For their Redeemer is strong. He will plead their cause against you. Now here, and this is what I really wanted to show here, right? And I want y'all to really understand something too. I'm going to show y'all in these two parallels here, these fifth parallels, right? The Redeemer, right, is capitalized. So we know who they're talking about. They're talking about the Most High God of Israel, the Redeemer of Israel. And it talks about Amenemope in the 6th chapter, right, page 239, lines 10 through 11. One satisfies God, small g, with the will of the Lord, who determines the boundaries of the arable land. Now, we see here, he talks about one satisfies God, small g, with the will of the Lord. So we know he's talking about a deity here, the deity, Lord. But what name is he given? Right? There is a name or a misnomer that they use that talks about supreme, that talks about the supreme God. But what Lord, what deity is he talking about here? Why doesn't it say Ra? Why doesn't it say Amen or Amun or Atum? Why doesn't it say that here? What Lord is he attributing these things to? Who determines the boundaries of the arable land? I'm going to show y'all in this presentation something very interesting when it comes to Amenemope and who he determines is his Lord. You're going to be very surprised. It says 6th parallel, the Proverbs 23:4-5. Do not toil to acquire wealth. Be discerning enough to desist. Right? What is that? That's our Sabbath. That's our Shabbat. That's taking a rest. Resting. When your eyes light on it, it is gone. For suddenly it sprouts wings, fly like an eagle towards heaven. What is he talking about? Chasing after that dollar. It's very elusive. You got folks out here, man, I'm going after that bag. And that's all they doing. They're chasing their bag. And they wind up doing all kind of crooked, behind, under the table, backdoor deals, stealing, lying, conning. Right? Putting on fixed debates. Getting people to pay for debates that don't happen. And folks never get a refund. All that type of stuff. You don't see that. You don't see that. But let's continue. It says in the 6th parallel, Amenemope, 7th chapter, page 239, lines 17 through 18. They have made themselves wings like geese and are flown away to the heavens. So now we're supposed to look at this and see the parallels and say, oh, They have made themselves wings like geese. Well, we know that the symbolism of geese is very prominent in the Kemetic culture, their material culture, right? They did a lot with the what you call it, the liver, the foie gras, right? I believe that's how you pronounce it. That was one of their delicacies, right? They also used a lot of the fat from the goose, the geese, to make balms, salves, oils, cook with it. You'll see a lot of that in ancient Kemetic culture, where the geese were very prominent to the economics of their culture, right? We don't see that in ancient Israel. The wine press, the olive, those things were our staples. This is why you often hear about vineyards, right? We were a more agrarian culture, right? We were more agriculturalist. So those types of things were more staple in the Hebraic culture, right? But look what it says. Even it talks about flying like an eagle, right? Flying like an eagle, right? Again, the eagle is different. It has a different symbolism for us in the Hebraic culture versus what we see in the Kemetic text or Kemetic culture, right? The eagle, for what we should mount up on wings like eagles, right? It has a more sense of spiritual strength and connection to the Most High. We don't see that same type of spiritual connection with geese. The culture is completely different. So if you're talking about parallels of plagiarism, there's no direct plagiarism. That's copied word for word. Again, that argument is out the door. Right? I have a few more of these because there are about 15 that they really make the argument on. We're on the sixth one. The seventh parallel, Proverbs 22 and 24. Make no friendship with a man given to anger, nor go with a wrathful man. Right? Here's the parallel that they present in the instructions of Amenemope in the 9th chapter, page 240, lines 1 and 2. Do not associate to thyself the heated man, nor visit him for conversation. I mean, these things are not unique from one culture to the next. And again, we talked about the thematic patterns. Again, there's none that exists between these two wisdom literatures. There's no pattern here. This is the 9th chapter of Amenemope, page 240, lines 1 and 2. We're still in the 22nd chapter of Proverbs. That also goes into this argument about the 30 chapters versus the 30 sayings. We're going to get into that as well. Right? So again, they're talking about things that are common to every culture. Proverbs 22 and 25. Lest you learn his ways and entangle yourself in a snare. Amenemope. Now, again, they go from lines 1 and 2 in the 9th chapter, page 240, from lines 1 and 2. And they go and they skip lines 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. No pattern here. There's no A, B, B, C, C. We don't have that here. We got A, then we got A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Like, there's no thematic pattern here. There's no process here. We're talking about a direct correlation of plagiarism. Doesn't exist, family. I'm telling you, it doesn't. Again, it says, Amenemope, 9th chapter, page 240, lines 13 to 14. Do not leap to hold such a one, lest a terror carry thee off. Right? These are things that are wisdoms that have been passed down from generations to generations. But they're not unique to one culture to the next. They're not. And I'm going to show you a list later on in this teaching, in this lecture, where you'll see there existed many wisdom texts that existed before we get to the instructions of Amenemope and before we get to Proverbs that have the same type of sayings and maxims in it. But no one's making that comparison and claiming plagiarism of the instructions of Amenemope between these other texts, when some of them say almost at times the exact same thing, word for word copy. More specifically, the instructions of TORAH, PTAH, the instructions of TORAH. You clearly see in that wisdom literature, you'll clearly see stronger parallels within the wisdoms of Amenemope at times than you do between these two texts, the instructions of Amenemope and Proverbs chapters 22, 23, and some of 24. You clearly see that here. Now watch this. Proverbs 23. It says, do not eat the bread of a man who is stingy. Do not desire his delicacies, for he is like one who is inwardly calculating. Eat and drink, he says to you, but his heart is not with you. You will vomit up the morsels that you have eaten and waste your pleasant words. In other words, be careful with stingy folks. Folks that don't really want you around. That's a lesson we need to learn today. We got folks in our houses, folks that you think are your friends. Folks will set you up. They will trick you into thinking you're your friend. They're your friend to try to get from you whatever it is that they can get from you. All the while, they're plotting against you. This puts me in mind of the young lady Robinson, rest in peace, rest in heaven, who had her own business, entrepreneur, young girl, happened a few months ago, took a bunch of her so-called friends with her down to Mexico, and there's a video that goes viral of a fight that breaks out between these so-called friends and this young lady who flew them all down there on her dime. And you see her naked body laid out on the bed. She's not moving. At that point, now that the authorities have determined she was lifeless at that point, she was already dead. She was beaten mercifully while her so-called friends stood around and videotaped it. These people who she trusted, who she thought was her friend, or people she was attempting to befriend, wanted their acceptance, wanted to show them a good time so that she can even get accolades or whatever the case may be. But be very mindful of people in these circumstances. These types of situations are not unique, as we even see. It's still happening today. It's not unique to Afro-Hebraic culture. It's not unique to Sumerian culture or Egyptian culture. It's ridiculous to make these arguments. These are wisdom texts. It's wisdom literature. And what do you expect to find in wisdom literature? Wisdom. Wisdom. The scripture tells us wisdom is the principal thing. You can have all the knowledge in the world, but if you don't have wisdom and how to use it, it'll benefit you and profit you nothing. So look at the parallel that they attempt to make in the instructions of Amenemope. Right? Be not greedy for the property of a poor man, nor hunger for his bread. The mouthful of bread too, great thou swallowest, and vomitest it up, and art empty of thy good. So in other words, again, these things we see are the same in understanding how you deal with people of certain character. Are you going to tell us that no people of character, of deceitfulness and deceitful character, they only existed in the culture of ancient Kemet? None existed in the Afro-Judeo culture. None existed in the Sumerian culture. None existed in the Babylonian culture. None existed in the Libyan culture. You're going to tell me deceitful people didn't exist in the world before any of these wisdom texts were written? But again, the argument of plagiarism, especially direct plagiarism, has to be thrown out because you don't see word for word. You don't see a copy. A copy is a mirror. A copy of me is what I look like standing in a mirror. That's a mirror image. That's a copy of me. If I take the Encyclopedia Britannica 2003 and I make copies of all the thousands of pages, and then I come and I pick up Encyclopedia Britannica from 2023, I can't say, look, these are the same, simply because they both say encyclopedia. One has more sayings in it and more word studies. One has more sayings in it and word studies. Contextual understanding of words and things have changed over the course of years and centuries and days. So how can I say these two things are the same or one's borrowed from the next? That's a very poor argument to make, and that's the argument that's being made between these two wisdom literature texts. Right? Let me get through this as well. The 10th parallel. And I'm showing you there are 15, and in this whole entire argument about plagiarism, was the instructions of Amenemope plagiarized by the scribes and writers of Proverbs. They're only talking about 15 specific verses in Proverbs in this poem. They're only talking about 15, right? That span barely 3 chapters, right? And I'm showing you, I started with the first parallel that they argue against, the case for parallelism 4. Now we're down to the 10th, 11, 12, and then one more slide. We'll get through all 15 of them, but I just wanted to bring them out to you first and read them, put them side by side so you can really see. So Proverbs 22, 26 to 27. Be not one of those who give pledges or who put up security for debts. If you have nothing with which to pay, why should your bed be taken from under you? Right? So this is a proverb. Be not one of those who give pledges. Don't make promises you can't keep. Right? Stop getting those high price loans. They got 500% interest rates. Those payday loans. If you have nothing with which to pay. You said, why would you do that? He said, why shouldn't your bed be taken from you? Why shouldn't you lose your car or your home when you get yourself in that much debt? That's a financial wisdom literature. People talk about, oh, the Bible is not relevant to us today. That's sound financial advice right there. Sound financial advice right there. Here we are again, the 10th parallel of instructions of Amenemope, 13th chapter, page 241, lines 8 and 10. If thou findest a large debt against a poor man, make it into 3 parts, forgive 2, and let 1 stand. Come on now. Y'all gotta be kidding me. This is the parallel that they're making? Amenemope, 13th chapter, page 241, lines 8 and 10. Simply because it talks about debt. It says, if thou findest a large debt against a poor man, make it into 3 parts, break it up into a third, a third, and a third, forgive 2, and only attribute him for the 1 payment. That's how he says how you do someone who don't really have money to pay for something. Right? If they have a large debt against a poor man, that's what you should do. But is that saying, be not one of those who give pledges, who put up security for debts, if you have nothing to pay? Come on, man. These are both sound wisdom literature and text. But they're making a parallel, and people are arguing that these things are plagiarized. That Proverbs is plagiarizing from the instructions of Amenemope. Like I said, it gets weirder as it goes along. How they just, you see what they did. You'll start to see what's going on after a while. It says the 11th parallel here. I'm going to try to get through this real quick. Proverbs 23 and 9. Do not speak in the hearing of a fool, for he will despise the good sense of your words. It's the same proverb. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. Fool me once, fool me twice, shame on me. A fool is a fool is a fool. We've heard those proverbs and sayings all over the place, but those are not unique and specific to a culture. But that comes from somebody dealing with a fool. And I guarantee you, as long as there have been men on this earth, there's been a fool. That's not unique to Proverbs. That's not unique to the instructions of Amenemope or any other culture. A fool is a fool is a fool. What are we doing here, people? What are we doing here? And these 15 parallelisms is the actual argument for plagiarism that people attempt to make between these two wisdom texts. Amenemope says, spread not thy words to the common people. Come on now. Common people are fools? Clearly, it's not talking about the same thing here. This is talking about now Amenemope, who is believed to have been a relative of Pharaoh, based on some of the titles that he was given. But clearly, he's in the hierarchy, he's in the nobility. And he's saying, listen, he's teaching his son, I believe it's Or-Mem-Kar, not to give certain things that we understand to the common folks. Don't tell them the next the next and latest, greatest, and hottest stock tips. Don't tell that to the comment folks because we don't want them getting in on it. Right? Don't tell them what the next tax, what the best tax loopholes are. We don't want them to be able to do it. The Proverbs of Solomon says, "Do not speak in the hearing of a fool." Amenemope says, "Spread not thy words to the common people." So you common folks is idiots. Is that what it's saying? "No associate to thyself one outgoing of heart." In other words, don't associate yourself with somebody who speaks their mind. That's half of y'all. This, I can say whatever I want to say. Stuff. Amenemope, his instructions say don't even talk to you. Clearly, people, like, some of these things are just ridiculous, but these are the arguments that's made. The 12th parallel, Proverbs 23, 1 through 3, like it. "When you sit down to eat with a ruler, observe carefully what is before you, and put a knife to your throat if you are given to appetite. Do not desire his delicacies, for they are deceptive food." In other words, this is proverb. This is a proverb. This is a teaching. Be careful when you sit down and you eat with folks that seemingly have more than you and riches than you. Right? Don't be so desirous to jump out at him because you want to be like them. You'll find yourself deceived. You'll find yourself being used. We hear about this type of stuff all the time. Let's look at the 12th parallel. The instructions of Amenemope, chapter 23, 240, page 242, lines 1 through 6. It says, "Do not eat bread before a noble, nor lay on thy mouth at first. If thou art satisfied with false chewings, they are a pastime for thy spittle. Look at the cup which is before thee, and let it serve thy needs." Again, these things are not unique. These things are not unique. The understanding of kings and priests and kings and their subjects and kings and people that are lay people to them and their servants, I should say. You find jealousy even in the story going back, dealing with David and Saul. Saul was a ruler. He was the ruler over David. He was the noble over David. David sat down to eat at his table. And Saul had much envy and jealousy against him that he tried to take his life. These things occurred before the book of Proverbs. But why is not the comparison being made there? There are many examples of these things in which we see things that are attributed to Solomon that we can attribute to why he's even saying these things. He would have known. Of the instance of his father, King David, and King Saul, in the issues there that occurred, in the jealousy. If we attribute this to Solomon, he would have learned this from his father. His father's personal experience. When you sit down to eat with the ruler, observe carefully what is before you and put a knife to your throat. If you are given to appetite, do not desire his delicacies, for they are deceptive food. We see this in First Kings, when Jezebel and Ahab and King Ahab invited Nabal, the owner of the vineyard that Ahab desired. They invited him to dinner in order to kill him, conspired against him to take his field. Why do they want his vineyard? To expand their coffers, to increase their wealth. So they wanted his land. So they invited him to dinner in order to set him up to have him killed. First Kings chapter 22, 21, I think chapters 21 to chapters 22. We see these things evident in the scripture. These things are common experiences, things that happen to people, not unique to a specific culture. We're going to get down to these last ones. The 13th parallel. Proverbs 22 to 23. Do not rob the poor because he is poor, or crush the afflicted at the gate, for the Lord will plead their cause and rob of life those who rob them. Again, we have the repeat, the pattern here. Right? Amenemope says in chapter 28, page 243, line 6 through 7, God, and this is what I really want people to understand. We've heard Amenemope use the term Lord as a deity. He uses the term, the misnomer God as well. But he never specifically mentions one as of yet. How come he didn't say Ra? He hasn't said Ra yet. He hasn't said Amun or Amen. He hasn't said that yet. This is very important to understand it when we're reading this text of Amenemope. Desires respect for the poor more than honoring of the exalted. Very last parallel that many argue about plagiarism between Proverbs 22 and the instructions of Amenemope. Proverbs 22 and 29. Do you see a man skillful in his work? He shall stand before kings. He will not stand before obscure men. In other words, your room will make gift. Your gift will make room for you. We read that as a New Testament saying. Your gift will make room for you. Here it is again. For those who say that the New Testament doesn't stretch back to the Old Testament, this is the only thing that they understood. So here we see them quoting Proverbs in the New Testament. Do you see a man skillful in his work? He shall stand before kings, and he will not stand before obscure men. It also says your gift will bring you before great men. It's also in the New Testament. The instruction of Amenemope says, as for the scribe, y'all killing me, bro. It says, as for the scribe who is experienced in his office, he will find himself worthy to be a courtier. Come on, man. Proverbs says, look, he said, a man is skillful in his work, whether you're a carpenter, whether you clean gym shoes, detail cars, whether whatever your skill is, whether you're a painter, whether you're an artist, a producer, whatever your skill is. If you're good at it, if you're good at cutting grass, whatever your skill is, if you're skillful at it, it'll bring you before great men. It'll get you in front of the people you need to be in that can help you. But they compare it to the instructions of Amenemope, chapter 30, page 243, lines 10 through 11. As for the scribe who is experienced in his office, he will find himself worthy to be a courtier. This is the sum of the parallels indicated between Amenemope in Proverbs 22, 17, 23 through 11. Now, I just went through, took the time and I had to do it for this series, this lecture series on it, to show you what the argument is really about. And it's really only about those 14 verses in Proverbs, those 14 sayings in the instructions of Amenemope. That's what the argument is. The argument of plagiarism rests between those particular verses. Now, you've seen them all here. I've gone through them all here. Right? Now let's continue. Let's see what else we got here. It says a claim that is made is that a portion of the biblical book of Proverbs is actually copied from the Egyptian source of Amenemope, according to Introduction, the Whole Testament by Greg for Abaddon Press, 1968, page 321. As has long been recognized, the first subsidiary collection, right? And now we're going to break it down what we just read. Proverbs 22, 17 to 21 is closely related to the Egyptian instruction of Amenemope, which probably dates between the 10th and 6th centuries, right? And if you really understand the biblical timeline, almost directly puts it at the same time that King David and King Solomon would have lived. Something else to think about. 10th and 6th centuries BCE. The introductory poem, 22 and 17, and the 10 themes discussed in 22 to 23 follow often word for word their Egyptian source. And what they're saying when they're talking about word for word, they're talking about words like they'll say that in this parallel in Proverbs, then parallel to something else in there that says that. Just one word, as I showed before. Just one single word. And they say, oh, see, it says that here, and it says that. But when we read the two in context, it's not even talking about the same circumstances when it comes to dealing with that. It's not even talking about the same thing. So this is why this argument is fallacious. Even the division of this source into 30 chapters or houses seems to have been borrowed by the Israelite redactor of the entire collection. This is the argument they're making, right? But again, we're going to talk about that understanding too, where the RSVP correctly reads 30 stands, or the Hebrew day before yesterday, or adjutants, right? Now, Benjamin Shaw, associate professor at Greenville University Theological Seminary, has written a series of short blogs answering this accusation on his personal journal, GPT as Rabbi. His analysis can be found in the following places, right? And this is what he talks about: teaching of Amenemope, a brief introduction to the problem, Amenemope Part 2, Professor Saw sets forth a complete list of various verses are alleged to have been from Amenemope to Proverbs. And then we go on and on and on and on and on. But this is one of the things that you really want to get to, because this is the crux when people often go to, right? In Amenemope chapter 4, let me go back here. Uh-oh. Let me go back here. See if I got it right here. Do something here. Go back here. Okay. Yeah, in Amenemope chapter 4, it talks about excellent things, or 30. And that's the big argument, right? This is like the linchpin to people argue about. Because see, they both have 30 sayings. Well, actually, the argument is whether or not does the text in Proverbs actually say 30 sayings, or does it say excellent things? Professor Shaw, Benjamin Shaw, compares two alternative translations of Proverbs 22 and 20 and determines whether the reading that the writer had passed along 30 sayings rather than excellent sayings is driven by the paradigm that Proverbs was copied from Amenemope. So in other words, he's saying someone assumed that. They assumed it. And they added 30 sayings instead of what is actually supposed to say excellent things. And if you really understand this argument, that's really a dagger. Right? So let's continue here. I'll get into this one later. Now let's get a clear understanding, right? Most of this argument was mainly brought out by initially E. Wallace Budge. A lot of you Egyptologists, you know, that's y'all daddy, whether y'all want to admit it or not. But there's neither here nor there for this argument. But let's look at Amenemope, Proverbs 23. It says, Adolf Ehrman, the dean of all Egyptologists, who in 1924 published an extensive list of correspondence between the text of Amenemope and the biblical book of Proverbs, with the bulk of them concentrated in Proverbs 22 and 17 verses chapters 23 and 11, which is the 14 verses that I read within those two chapters. Right? It is this guy right here, Adolf Ehrman, right? And he's not the initial person, but he's the most prominent one because it's his assumptions that they build off of. And watch, he'll tell you, and watch what happens. It says it was Ehrman who used, listen to this, people. It was Ehrman who used Amenemope, the instructions of Amenemope, to amend a difficult reading in the text of Proverbs 22 and 20, where the Hebrew word shelsham, which means 3 days ago, appeared to be a copyist error that could be meaningfully translated only with difficulty. So here, again, this is the linchpin to the entire argument, right? It really comes down to this understanding of 30 sayings versus does it say excellent sayings? You'll be amazed when you really get down into the understanding of these arguments, what a lot of this stuff is based on, right? He says it was Ehrman who used to Amenemope to figure out what was actually being said or being dealt with in the book of Proverbs, whether it was a difficult reading. Why? Because it didn't make sense to them. So they assumed that it was a copyist error. It's literally what happens here. This guy here, Adolf Ehrman, right? This is really a culprit right here to this whole controversy. right? Now watch this. Ehrman pointed out that substituting the similar word shiloshim for 30 not only made good sense in context, but yielded the following close parallel between the two texts, with the now restored 30 sayings in Proverbs 22 and 20, corresponding exactly to the 30 numbered chapters in Amenemope. You see what happened here? You see what happened here? This guy here, Ehrman, says, look, watch this. This word here that he actually sees in Proverbs 22 and 20 in 1924, he says where the Hebrew word shilsham, which means 3 days ago, appeared to be a copyist error. He said that's a copyist error because it really doesn't make sense. Why would they say 3 days ago? This is what he's saying, because he's looking at this word, shilsham, in the Hebrew, in Proverbs 22 and 20. He says, why would they put 3 days ago? It has to be a copyist error because it doesn't make sense in the context, right? So he assumes that it's a copyist error. You watch what he does, right? It says, Ehrman pointed out that substituting the similar word, so he takes it upon himself and said, well, if we take the similar word of shilsham and put shiloshim, which means 30, then it would make sense in context in Proverbs 22 and 20. It says, I have not written for you 30 sayings of counsel and knowledge. But he took it upon himself, Ehrman, to say that it should actually read 30 sayings instead of what it actually says. This word right here, shilsham, 3 days ago. So it doesn't make sense. Something's wrong. Must be a copyist error. So let's change it to this. And now when we change it to 30, now it clearly matches up to Amenemope chapter 30, line 539. Look to these 30 chapters. They inform, they educate. Now you see, this is where the deception comes in at people with this whole argument that Adolf Ehrman says, look, the context for shilsham, which he believes that it means in the Hebrew 3 days ago, doesn't make sense in the context from Proverbs 22 and 20. He says, but if you change it to the Hebrew word shiloshim, then it would mean 30. And then we can say, yeah, now that lines up with the instructions of Amenemope when he talks about, I've looked at these 30 chapters. Where they do that at, family? Where they do that at? And so now you get this crazy argument now that people now begin to say the instructions of Amenemope was plagiarized by Proverbs or a scribe who was the writer of Proverbs chapters 20, 22, 23, and possibly 24. This is where this argument comes from, because this guy decided that this should be the proper word than what he actually reads in the scripture 1924. It gets even crazier, family. Watch this. Adolf Ehrman also argued that this correspondence demonstrated that the Hebrew text had been influenced by the Egyptian instead of the other way around. Because before his time, the understanding of Proverbs was that it actually influenced Kemetic texts or Kemetic understandings and renderings. But in him changing that specific word, just that one word in Proverbs 22 and 20, that he assumes is a copyist error, now he's able to argue, or attempts to argue, in the reverse, that Proverbs is actually taken from the Egyptian text or the instructions of Amenemope. Explicitly enumerates 30 chapters, whereas the Hebrew text of Proverbs does not have such clear-cut divisions, and would therefore be more likely to lose the original meaning during copying. Since Ehrman's time, there has been a near consensus among scholars that there exists a literary connection between the two works, although the direction of influence remains contentious even today. This is what I'm saying, family. Because how they even date the instructions of Amenemope, they don't know which influence which. There's a majority of scholars that says now, because of what his work was of Ehrman's work in 1924, but it's no absolution. It's all theory. It's all theory and speculation. Watch this. And I'm approaching the 2-hour mark on this. And we're going to continue this. I'll be making the advertisement on tomorrow when I'll be doing the the third installment of this series, because we're going to really get into it. Watch this. Amenemope 4 excellent things of 30. Amenemope 4 excellent things of 30. Professor Shaw compares two different alternative translations of Proverbs 22 and 20 and determines whether the reading that the writer had passed along 30 sayings rather than excellent things is driven by the paradigm that Proverbs was copied from Amenemope. And the reason why he says that is because of Adolf Ehrman's work in saying, listen, these two words, and I'll go back and show you that these two words, Shilsham, which he originally saw in the text, and he believed made no contextual understanding, or was difficult to understand. He said, if we simply change it, if I argue we simply change it to this and change it to 30, then we can say and compare it to the instructions of Amenemope, chapter 30, line 539, where it says, look to these 30 chapters. They inform, they instruct. But what they're talking about that's plagiarized from the instructions of Amenemope, I just went through the 14 parallels. Those are not 30 chapters. Even that's false. You're comparing 14 verses to 30 chapters and saying that it's plagiarized? It's ridiculous. Well, let's continue. Right? So now, Professor Shaw, who I gave, who I sourced out early in this presentation, says in Proverbs 22 determines whether the reading that the writer had passed along 30 sayings rather than excellent sayings is driven by the paradigm that Proverbs was copied from Amenemope. In the KJV, Proverbs 22 and 20 reads, have I not written to thee excellent things in counsels and knowledge? The ASV, published in 1901, and the Jewish Publication Society translation, published in 1917, say essentially the same thing. That's before 1924, when the discovery of the instructions of Amenemope was announced, and people began to actually look at it. And before Adolf Ehrman says, look, in 1924, I think this is a copyist error. It shouldn't be there. Let's change it to 30. Then that really does line up with the 30 sayings of the 30 chapters of Amenemope, chapter 30. You see what happened here, people? In 1917, 1901, 1970, the translation essentially says having of in the place of in, but otherwise identical. And what it says, have I not written to thee excellent things? It either says of counsel and knowledge or in counsels and knowledge. It says excellent things, not 30, not 3 days ago. It says excellent things. But otherwise identical. The NASB in the NASB update read the same. The ESV and most other modern verses read something like, have I not written for you 30 sayings of counsel and knowledge? Why? Because these translations here are produced after 1924, when Ehrman begins to make the argument. But before then, it read excellent sayings before 1924. In the Jewish Publication Society, these things were different. Didn't say the same thing. How do the translators get from excellent things to 30 sayings? And is that move legitimated by the text itself? The first thing to recognize is that the word that is so variously rendered is itself something of difficulty in the Hebrew text. The consonantal text, as inherited by the Masoretic scribes, reads shilsham, but the scribes themselves indicate that the word is to be read shalishim. Now watch this. The word shilsham literally means the day before yesterday, more loosely meaning formerly. However, it always elsewhere occurs as a part of the phrase Timol Shilsham, meaning yesterday and the day before, but with the general sense of formerly. One could thus assume that this is simply a case where Timol has been omitted and translated, I have written to you previously. This is suggested by the Brown's Driver Briggs DVD lexicon, where it reads, it's suggested that it reads, I have written to you previously these things, not 30 sayings or excellent sayings or excellent things. In Proverbs 22, verse 20. It says the word shalishim is the plural of shalish, meaning an officer of some sort. This does not seem to fit the context. Hence the BDB comment that this is impossible. The older versions seem to have taken the term officer as a figure of excellence. Hence their renderings of this verse. A fuller discussion of this view, tracing the development of the thinking of the rendering, can be found in the Kiel and Delitzsch commentary on this verse. Watch this. The Septuagint is not helpful in clearing up the difficulty because it renders the word by trisos, meaning 3 times. 3 times, not 30, but 3 times. So even in the Septuagint doesn't even say 30 sayings. And this is before the 1934 rendering or commentary by Adolf Ehrman, who says it should say 30. But the Septuagint itself says what? 3 times. This seems to be roughly equivalent to the meaning of shilsham, the original word there in the Hebrew text. This is also the reading reflected in the Syriac Peshitta and the Targums. That's what it reads, family. Not 30. Watch this. How then did the modern versions arrive at 30? They arrived at this view under the influence of the supposition that this section of Proverbs was derived from Amenemope. None of the versions done prior to the discovery of Amenemope suggest taking the consonantal shilsham as shaloshim, but virtually all of the what? Modern versions do so. All of the modern versions do so. But the older original text never says that this is 30 sayings in the book of Proverbs, chapters 22, verse 20. It never says, look at these 30 sayings. These are 30 sayings. It does not say that. These are 30 maxims. It never says that in the original context. It says 3 or excellent. That's the rendering. It's 3. Or as the original seems to be 3 days ago, but 3. In the Septuagint says trisos, or 3, not 30. In the last time I checked, 30 is not 3. I'm going to put in 11 o'clock hour. It says, they would think that if Proverbs 22:17 through 24:22 were in fact dependent on the Amenemope, that there would be stronger parallels in order and wording of content that than there in fact are. One would also assume that one can easily find 30 chapters in the Proverbs material, matching the 30 chapters of Amenemope. But is that the case? Right? So I am going to end this teaching here for tonight. We're up on 2 hours. I appreciate all those who come in. Let me go through these real quick. Appreciate you, family. Shout out to Anonymous Hebrew. Shout out to Yirmiyahu Israel. Shout out to Sister Noble. KOT, Principal Howard. Peace to you, family. Thanks on the ground. Shout out to you, Simone Lowe. Shimon Lowe. Shout out to you. Shalom. Simon Lowe, I believe it is. Shout out to you, Simeon the Atheist Killer. Peace to you, fam. Again, Sosa, shout out to you, family. Appreciate you. FSK was in the building tonight. Shalom. Shout out to Lex Vortex, man. Lex Vortex in the building, man. Shout out to you, Lex. Indigenous Black man, peace, family, peace. Appreciate you for your wisdom, family. I don't sleep on Indigenous Black man. I see you, brother. I don't sleep on him, man. That's a powerful brother right there. Yahoo Israel, I appreciate you, fam. I appreciate you, family. I appreciate you, family. That's what it's all about. I'm here to assist whichever way that I can. Right? I don't ever claim to be always right, but I don't ever claim to be always wrong. I try to allow the Most High to lead and guide me on what I teach and what I bring forward. And if people take issue with that, I'm always open for discussion. But I like to try to arm Israel to a lot of this foolishness that's going on in there, man. Around it. But again, I appreciate y'all, fam. I'm going to be finishing this out because I really want to get into it as well. There's some interesting things that I really want to drop. Let me just share this real quick. I want to show y'all something, man. I want to show y'all something real quick. It's before I jump off of here. Let me see where I got this thing at, man. Let me see where I got this thing at. Hold on. Let me see where I got this thing in, man.
think it's right here. Yeah. I want to show y'all something about this guy. Amenemope, right? I'm just going to show y'all what I'm looking at right here so y'all can see it. Let me share my screen real quick. I'm just going to bring this out, but I want y'all to see this. Those of y'all who still with me, I want y'all to see this. I'm going to share my screen real quick. All right. This is the wisdom of Amenemope. I just want to show y'all the book. But I really wanted to show y'all some things that are actually in here when it talks about Amenemope, right? Let me go here to this. And I read the book, so I know what it says. It agrees with me in some parts, and other parts it doesn't. But that's fine. But I want to go to something real quick, right? I want y'all to understand something about Amenemope. And I think it's right here, because this is actually an English translation of the instructions of Amenemope. I want y'all to see something. I think it's right here. Let me go back. I want y'all to see something. I want y'all to read something. All right, here. This is chapter 5, right? This is what I want y'all to understand, right? It says, watch this. This is the instructions of the Amenemope, right? It says, make no changes to the dikes of the house of God. Do not commit any act of avarice to gain additional wealth. Do not make a servant of God turn away from his duty to do what is profitable for another man. Do not say today is just like tomorrow morning will be. What is the point of this? Tomorrow has yet to come, and today has yet to pass. The water flood is on the crest of the surging waves. The crocodiles make themselves visible from the mud. The hippopotamuses appear in the light from the water. The fish leap in the waters. The wolves gorge themselves. The geese celebrate. The restraining ropes are thrown loose. Now every ger of the house of God will say, great is the graciousness of Ra. You who are filled with silence, you will find life. Your body will be preserved in the safety on the earth, right? Now, look at the footnote here, right? You see the one here? Look at what they say here. In the footnote here, it says this verse makes it clear that Amenemope was not a Ra worshiper, as he urges his readers to not become one of the crowd that praises Ra when there is a calamity, to instead remain silent and be saved. He says, look, Amenemope says, look, be saved. If you want to be saved, be quiet. Don't extol or praise Ra. Give him no credence. Give him no credence. So again, we clearly see and understand that Amenemope was not even a worshiper of Ra himself. He simply was not.
I found that very interesting. Very interesting. Also, if you notice, he has the word Amen in his name, Amenemope. You'll see throughout the instructions of Amenemope where he gives no worship, but it does not even extol the name Amen or Amun or Atun. He doesn't extol it in no way, form, or fashion, but he does what? He talks about it. He talks about the God, the supreme being, right? Here in chapter 6, look what he says. He says, likewise, make sacrifices of atonement to God through the will of who? Uh-oh. Uh-oh. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about this, family. We're going to talk about that. Let me stop sharing my screen. So again, I appreciate y'all, family. Thanks for tuning in. Man, like, share, and subscribe. Let somebody know, man. This is no friend zone. It's on the air. We're doing teachings over here, man. We're going to be doing some other types of discussions and things like that, but we're still going to be doing with this. There's going to be a couple more parts left to the series, some other things I want to bring out the show. But again, peace and blessings to you, family. I appreciate everything, man. And again, this is no friend zone, man. Peace. You have now entered the no friend zone.